I was on top of the world, man. I can buy anything I want, when I want. I always had 30, 40,000 in the bank. You know how many times I wanted to commit suicide? Because I went from owning 2 homes, some property in Arkansas.
Every bad thing in the world away. You have no stress, no problems, everything's, you're on a cloud.
There was a time when the streets of Tucson were known for something entirely different. For postcard sunsets stretching across the Sonoran horizon, for towering saguaros standing like ancient guardians beneath an endless blue sky, for neighborhoods where families gathered on quiet porches as warm desert winds drifted through open windows, and for a rhythm of life that felt slower, safer, and somehow untouched by the chaos swallowing so many American cities. But somewhere between the beauty that tourists come searching for and the reality most cameras never stop to capture, another Tucson began to emerge, one hidden in plain sight, one unfolding beneath freeway overpasses, inside dry riverbeds, behind abandoned shopping centers, and along sidewalks where hundreds now wake up every morning wondering whether survival itself has become their full-time job. And if you think that sounds dramatic, stay with this story. Because what is happening here in 2026 is not simply a housing crisis, not simply a drug crisis, and not simply another headline designed to shock people scrolling past uncomfortable truths. What is happening here feels closer to something much deeper, something more personal, something that forces an entire community to ask itself one uncomfortable question. How does a city built under endless sunshine become a place where thousands now live in the shadows? According to the reference material and point-in-time figures analyzed from the Tucson homelessness reporting, more than 2,000 people were counted experiencing homelessness across the region in 2026, with a majority living completely unsheltered, surviving not inside shelters, not inside temporary housing, but directly on the streets, beneath bridges, inside tents, abandoned washes, alleyways, and forgotten corners of a city that keeps moving while they remain frozen in survival mode. And behind every one of those numbers, there is a face, a name, a story, a life that once looked nothing like this. One man, speaking with a kind of honesty that only comes after everything has already fallen apart, described a life where he once owned 2 homes, carried money in the bank, bought whatever he wanted whenever he wanted, and believed the future belonged to him. Until one series of choices, one chain of losses, one spiral he never saw coming, pulled him into a world where even sleeping without fear became a luxury. Now imagine waking up tomorrow, with no front door, no bathroom, no kitchen, no safe place to leave your belongings, no guarantee that what little you own will still be there by sunrise. Could you survive even 1 week like that? Because for many in Tucson, this is not a thought experiment. This is Monday. This is Tuesday. This is every single day. And nowhere does that reality hit harder than after sunset, when the desert begins its quiet transformation. Because while most people see Arizona heat and imagine relentless sunshine, what many never realize is how quickly this landscape can turn from beautiful to brutal, from warm to punishing, from breathtaking to deadly. By afternoon, temperatures here can climb well beyond 100 degrees, turning asphalt into a burning surface that radiates heat through shoes, clothing, and skin, draining the body faster than most people can imagine, while dehydration, exhaustion, confusion, and exposure become constant companions for anyone forced to remain outdoors hour after hour, day after day. But when night falls, everything changes. The same desert that burned all afternoon suddenly begins to pull its warmth away, replacing scorching heat with sharp cold, darkness, isolation, and the sound of distant traffic echoing across open washes where entire encampments now try to disappear before anyone notices they exist. And that is where another crisis begins. Because while extreme weather may be the visible enemy, many outreach workers say the invisible threat is moving even faster. Across Tucson's growing encampments, reports continue to surface about synthetic opioids, counterfeit pills, and substances that many users themselves admit no longer resemble what they once knew, creating a cycle where dependency, vulnerability, exploitation, and physical collapse can happen in a matter of hours instead of months. Some who spoke from the streets described watching people lose limbs to untreated infections, losing consciousness in public spaces, waking up robbed, assaulted, or simply abandoned while under the influence. And many now describe a street environment where trust itself has become one of the rarest commodities left. And that raises another difficult question. When the thing that promises escape becomes the very thing destroying what little stability remains, how do you come back from that? Because this story is not just about tents. It is not just about drugs. And it is not just about poverty. This is about what happens when trauma meets addiction, when addiction meets economic collapse, and when economic collapse collides with a housing market that many working families can barely survive themselves. And perhaps that is why what's happening in Tucson feels so unsettling to so many people watching from the outside, because deep down, beneath the headlines, beneath the politics, beneath the statistics and the social media arguments, there is an uncomfortable truth that nobody really wants to admit. The distance between stability and survival may be much smaller than most people think. One medical emergency, one lost paycheck, one family breakdown, one eviction notice, one mistake, one relapse, 1 month. That is all it takes. And for some, even less. So as we continue deeper into this documentary, the real question is no longer whether Tucson has a homelessness crisis. The real question is whether Tucson is becoming a warning sign for cities all across America. And what we found next, hidden inside the dry washes, abandoned camps, and forgotten corners of this desert city, reveals a side of survival that most people will never forget once they see it. If this story matters to you, if these human realities deserve more than a passing glance, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. What do you believe is the real root of America's growing homelessness crisis, addiction, housing, mental health, or something even deeper? Because in the next section, we step directly inside Tucson's encampments, where survival is no longer about rebuilding a life. It is about making it through one more night. If the streets of Tucson looked unsettling from a distance, what we found when we moved closer revealed something far more difficult to ignore, because beyond the traffic lights, beyond the restaurants filled with families, beyond the desert trails visited by tourists chasing sunsets and postcard photographs, there exists another Tucson that most people pass every single day without ever truly seeing, a hidden world built from torn tarps, shopping carts, weathered backpacks, broken bicycles, plastic water containers, and tents so thin that one hard wind could erase everything a person owns in a matter of seconds. And yet for hundreds of people living here, these fragile spaces are not temporary stops. They have become home. The deeper we moved into the encampments scattered across dry riverbeds and abandoned lots, the first thing that stood out was not anger, and it was not chaos, but exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that settles deep into a person after months, sometimes years, of waking up every morning with no certainty about food, water, safety, or even where the next night will be spent, because survival here begins before sunrise, when the desert air still carries a hint of cold, and people quietly begin packing what little they own before city workers, security patrols, or law enforcement arrive and tell them it is time to move again, and again, and again. The instability described throughout the Tucson accounts reflects exactly that daily reality. Now imagine living that way for 30 days, then 90, then an entire year. How long do you think your mind would hold together before exhaustion started making decisions for you? One woman living near a drainage wash described the hardest part not as hunger, not as heat, and not even as fear, but as never being able to fully rest, because even while sleeping, part of her mind remained awake, listening for footsteps, listening for voices, listening for the sound of someone unzipping her tent or digging through the few belongings she had left. And the painful truth is that many here describe the same thing, because on the street, vulnerability is not occasional. It is constant. And then there is the water. In a city where summer temperatures regularly climb past 100 degrees, access to clean drinking water becomes more than a convenience. It becomes the line between surviving and collapsing, and for people living in remote washes or hidden camps far from public facilities, every gallon becomes a calculated decision, whether to drink it now, save it for later, wash with it, or share it with someone whose condition may already be worse than your own. According to the environmental conditions described throughout the Tucson reporting, many unsheltered residents spend entire mornings simply searching for shade, hydration, and somewhere safe enough to pause. And that raises another uncomfortable question. If basic survival starts with finding water, what happens when your body begins failing before noon? Because for some, the answer is frighteningly simple. They self-medicate. Not always for pleasure. Not always for escape. Sometimes just to keep moving. And that is where the fentanyl crisis begins to collide with homelessness in ways that even outreach workers say have become increasingly difficult to manage. Because what once looked like addiction from the outside often begins with untreated pain, untreated trauma, untreated mental health struggles, sleepless nights, unbearable heat, and the desperate need to shut off a mind that has been stuck in survival mode for far too long. Multiple first-hand accounts from Tucson describe substances on the street becoming more unpredictable, more dangerous, and far less forgiving than in years past. But what happens when the thing that numbs pain also makes you an easier target? What happens when losing consciousness means waking up without your shoes, your backpack, your medications, or the identification you need to ever rebuild your life? For many living here, that is not a possibility. That is routine. And perhaps the most haunting part of walking through these encampments was not seeing poverty. It was seeing how quickly identity itself begins to disappear, because the longer someone remains outside, the more the routines that once defined them begin to fade, the work schedules, the family dinners, the birthday calls, the rent payments, the morning coffee, the simple act of locking your own front door. Until one day the person who once managed a business, raised children, owned property, or paid taxes no longer introduces themselves by who they were, but by where they sleep. And that should make every one of us stop and think. Because how many bad months separate ordinary stability from this reality? 1, 3, 6. As we continue deeper into Tucson's growing crisis, what comes next may be even harder to ignore, because behind the tents, behind the addiction, and behind the survival stories lies another force quietly trapping thousands in place, a housing system many say no longer works for the people who need it most. If this story is opening your eyes, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. What do you believe breaks a person first? The streets, the addiction, or the feeling that nobody sees you anymore? Because what we uncover next changes everything. By now, it would be easy to assume that what is happening on the streets of Tucson begins and ends with addiction, encampments, and the brutal reality of desert survival. But the deeper we looked, the more another truth began to emerge, a truth far less visible than tents beneath overpasses or shopping carts lined along sidewalks, and far more unsettling because it reaches into apartment complexes, hospital waiting rooms, family kitchens, and workplaces all across the city, quietly pulling people toward the edge long before they ever spend a single night outside. Because for thousands here, homelessness did not begin with drugs. It began with a bill they could not pay, a rent increase they could not absorb, a medical emergency they never saw coming, or a single job loss that turned one missed payment into a complete collapse. And that raises a question that deserves your full attention. If you lost your income tomorrow, how many months would stand between you and the street? For some watching this, the answer may feel uncomfortable. For many in Tucson, that answer already arrived. As housing costs continued rising across southern Arizona, people who once considered themselves stable found themselves caught in a system moving faster than their paychecks could ever keep up with. Because while wages climbed slowly, rents moved with a completely different urgency, forcing working families, retirees, single parents, veterans, and even full-time employees into impossible choices between groceries, prescriptions, transportation, childcare, and keeping a roof over their heads. The Tucson reporting describes economic and housing-related pressures as one of the biggest barriers keeping people from returning to stable living. And what makes this even more unsettling is how ordinary these stories sound in the beginning. A mechanic misses work after surgery. A waitress loses hours after tourism slows. A warehouse employee gets laid off after a staffing cut. A mother falls behind after one emergency room visit. A veteran burns through savings while waiting for disability support. And suddenly, what once looked like a temporary setback begins turning into overdue notices, collection calls, storage units, borrowed couches, uncomfortable conversations with relatives, and eventually, nowhere left to go. How many people do you think are only one unexpected event away from that same spiral? Because the people living in Tucson's encampments were not all born into chaos. Many had careers. Some owned homes. Some raised children. Some built businesses. Some served their country. And yet the longer we listened, the more one phrase kept repeating itself in different forms. I never thought this could happen to me. That sentence may be the most chilling part of this entire story, because it reminds us that homelessness often does not announce itself with drama. It arrives quietly, first through stress, then through debt, then through shame, then through silence. And by the time many people ask for help, they are already drowning. But financial collapse is only part of what is happening here, because behind many of these stories lies another crisis that rarely makes the headlines with the same urgency. Untreated mental health struggles, trauma that never healed, anxiety that never stopped, depression that quietly deepened, and a system so overloaded that many people wait weeks or even months for consistent care while trying to survive outside. Tucson's homelessness reports noted hundreds of individuals living with serious mental health challenges while experiencing homelessness, revealing how deeply emotional and psychological struggles intersect with life on the street. Now imagine trying to manage panic attacks. Without privacy, without sleep, without medication, without knowing where your next meal is coming from. How long before even simple decisions begin to feel impossible? For people already living on the edge, untreated mental health struggles do not just create emotional pain. They create practical barriers that make recovery infinitely harder, because missing one appointment can mean losing access to services, losing paperwork can mean restarting applications, losing identification can mean losing opportunities, and when every day is built around simply staying alive, long-term planning becomes something that feels almost impossible to hold on to. And that is where the cycle becomes truly devastating. Because homelessness creates trauma. And trauma makes escaping homelessness even harder. And perhaps that is why so many outreach workers describe the streets of Tucson not simply as a housing crisis, but as a place where economic pressure, mental exhaustion, addiction, and isolation feed each other until rebuilding starts to feel almost unreachable. So here is the question nobody can afford to ignore. When someone loses both stability and hope at the same time, which one do you think is harder to rebuild first? Because what we uncovered next reveals that this crisis no longer affects only those sleeping outside, it is now reshaping entire neighborhoods, local businesses, public spaces, and the way communities see one another every single day. If this story is making you think differently, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. Do you believe America's homelessness crisis starts with personal choices, broken systems, or something much deeper? Because what happens next on the streets of Tucson may challenge everything you thought you understood. By the time most people begin to understand the human cost of what is happening on the streets of Tucson, another layer of this crisis is already unfolding in plain sight, one that reaches far beyond tents, encampments, and the individuals struggling to survive beneath the desert sun, because what begins as personal hardship does not stay isolated for long. And when thousands of people are forced to live without stable shelter in public spaces never designed for long-term survival, the ripple effects begin touching neighborhoods, businesses, families, emergency responders, healthcare systems, schools, and entire communities that suddenly find themselves confronting a reality they were never fully prepared for. And this is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because now the question is no longer just how people end up homeless. The question becomes, what happens to a city when homelessness becomes impossible to ignore? Walk through parts of downtown Tucson early in the morning, before office buildings fully wake up, before coffee shops open their doors, before traffic reaches its daily rhythm, and you begin noticing small signs that something deeper is changing: boarded windows where local stores once welcomed foot traffic, security cameras mounted where flower baskets used to hang, sidewalks marked by sleeping bags rolled against concrete walls. Business owners arriving early not to prepare for customers, but to clean graffiti, remove debris, check door locks, and quietly hope that today brings fewer emergencies than yesterday. And for many local merchants, these are no longer occasional inconveniences. They have become part of daily operations. Reports tied to Tucson's broader homelessness discussions describe increasing financial pressure on business districts, from rising maintenance costs to security concerns and declining customer confidence in heavily impacted areas. But before anyone rushes to blame one side or the other, pause for a moment. Because what makes this crisis so emotionally difficult is that every perspective carries its own truth. A small restaurant owner worries about employees walking safely to work before sunrise. A mother worries about her children crossing public parks alone. A retail worker worries about unpredictable encounters on the way home. An elderly resident worries about emergency response times growing longer. And just a few feet away, a man sleeping beneath an overpass worries whether his shoes will still be there when he wakes up. So here is a question worth asking. When survival and public safety begin competing for the same space, whose fear gets heard first? That tension now defines many of Tucson's most visible public spaces, because sidewalks that once served as simple walkways have become shared environments where commuters, tourists, outreach workers, business owners, law enforcement, and unsheltered residents all move through the same physical space carrying completely different realities, completely different fears, and completely different expectations of what safety should look like. And perhaps that explains why conversations around homelessness in Tucson have become increasingly emotional, increasingly political, and increasingly divided, because for some residents, the growing visibility of encampments feels like evidence that the city is losing control, while for outreach workers and advocates, those same encampments represent people who have simply run out of places left to go. And that difference in perspective changes everything. Because moving people from one sidewalk to another may make a block look cleaner for a day. But does it actually solve anything? Does removing tents remove trauma? Does pushing camps farther from downtown remove addiction? Does forcing people into the shadows make communities safer? Or simply less aware? These are the uncomfortable questions city leaders, law enforcement agencies, outreach organizations, and neighborhood groups continue wrestling with every single week. And the answers are rarely simple, because each solution seems to create another challenge somewhere else. Shelters fill up. Waiting lists grow longer. Emergency rooms become overflow systems. Police calls increase. Mental health teams stretch thinner. And public frustration continues building on every side. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this entire layer of the crisis is not the conflict itself. It is the growing invisibility that comes with it. Because the longer people remain on the street, the more society begins seeing them as a problem to manage instead of a person to understand. And over time, something even more dangerous than poverty begins taking hold. Disconnection. The avoided eye contact. The quick change in walking pace. The silent decision to cross the street. The conversations that suddenly stop when someone approaches. And while these moments may seem small to the people passing by, for someone already carrying trauma, rejection, and loss, those moments can quietly reinforce the belief that they no longer belong anywhere. So let me ask you something honestly. How much can a person lose before they stop believing recovery is possible? Because in Tucson, that question is no longer theoretical. It is unfolding every single day across neighborhoods, public parks, shopping districts, transit stops, and forgotten corners of the city where human dignity is being tested in ways most people will never personally experience. And yet, even in the middle of this tension, this exhaustion, and this growing divide, something unexpected is beginning to emerge. Because behind the headlines, behind the politics, and behind the daily struggle for public space, there are signs that some people in Tucson are no longer asking how to hide the crisis. They are asking how to actually solve it. If this story is challenging the way you see your own community, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. What matters most in a crisis like this? Public safety, compassion, accountability, or long-term solutions? Because in our final chapter, we uncover the programs, the partnerships, and the people fighting to prove that even in the harshest desert, hope can still take root. After everything we have seen across the streets of Tucson, after walking through encampments hidden beneath freeway overpasses, after hearing stories of addiction, trauma, economic collapse, untreated mental health struggles, rising public tension, and lives pushed so close to the edge that even the next sunrise can feel uncertain, it would be easy to believe that this story ends exactly where so many others do, with frustration, with political arguments, with headlines designed to shock people for a moment before they move on to something easier to watch. But what we discovered in the final chapter of Tucson's crisis tells a very different story, because buried beneath all the pain, all the exhaustion, and all the visible hardship, something else is quietly beginning to take shape. And it does not begin with speeches. It does not begin with slogans. And it certainly does not begin with quick fixes. It begins with one simple but powerful question. What happens when a city finally decides that moving people is no longer enough, and starts focusing on rebuilding lives instead? That question is now shaping some of the most important conversations happening across Tucson, because while many people still see homelessness as a problem that grows larger every year, outreach workers, nonprofit organizations, healthcare providers, local businesses, volunteers, and city planners are beginning to approach the crisis from an entirely different direction, one built not around temporary visibility, but around long-term stability. And perhaps that is where the first real signs of hope begin. According to the Tucson reporting, Housing First initiatives and expanded community partnerships have already helped hundreds of individuals transition into more stable living situations, while climate-adapted shelters, shaded rest areas, and permanent water access points have started appearing in areas where extreme heat once turned basic survival into a daily emergency. These developments reflect a growing effort to create solutions built specifically for the realities of desert life. Now pause for a moment and think about that. Imagine spending months or years sleeping outside, constantly moving, constantly guarding your belongings, constantly preparing for the worst. And then one day, someone hands you a key, not a meal, not a blanket, not a temporary bed, a key, a private door, a lock, a bathroom, a place where nobody tells you to move before sunrise. How much could that change a person's mind? How much could that change their future? For many people who have spent years surviving outside, outreach teams say the emotional impact of stability is almost impossible to measure, because the first night inside permanent housing often brings something many had forgotten even existed. Silence. Real silence. No traffic. No footsteps outside a tent. No fear of being robbed. No anxiety about whether the police will clear the area before dawn. Just a room, a door, and the rare feeling that tomorrow might finally look different. But housing alone does not solve everything, because what happens after someone gets inside may be just as important as what helped them get there in the first place. A person recovering from addiction still needs treatment. A veteran carrying trauma still needs counseling. A mother rebuilding after eviction still needs childcare and employment support. A worker who lost everything after medical debt still needs income, transportation, and a chance to restore credit, documentation, and dignity. And that is why Tucson's newest partnerships are becoming so important, because many of these programs are no longer treating homelessness as one single issue. They are treating it as what it truly is: a collision of housing, healthcare, employment, mental health, trauma, family breakdown, and economic pressure all happening at once. And that brings us to perhaps the most important question in this entire documentary. If someone has spent years learning how to survive, how long does it take to teach them how to live again? Because recovery is rarely dramatic. It does not happen overnight. It does not happen in one interview, one donation, one program, or one lucky break. Real change usually happens quietly. A job interview attended. A counseling appointment kept. A family member answering the phone. A medication refill picked up on time. A paycheck deposited. A bed made in the morning. A key still sitting in the same pocket 30 days later. These moments may seem ordinary to most people, but for someone who once believed their life was permanently over, they can feel revolutionary. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson Tucson is teaching the rest of America right now, because this city, standing beneath the same harsh desert sun that exposes every weakness, is also proving something equally powerful: that communities do not become stronger by pretending suffering does not exist. They become stronger when they choose to face it together. So before we close this journey, I want to ask you one final question. If someone in your community lost everything tomorrow, would they find judgment first, or help? And maybe that answer says more about all of us than any statistic ever could. Thank you for staying with us through every part of this story, through every difficult truth, every uncomfortable question, and every human voice that too often goes unheard. If this documentary moved you, challenged you, or made you see homelessness through a different lens, take a moment to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that reveal what is truly happening in communities across America. Because awareness begins with attention, and change begins the moment enough people decide to care.